Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the second session of Great Lives Inspiring Right Practice program conducted by Tan Amarasiri. On behalf, before I hand things over to Tan Amarasiri, I request the community to come together and pay our respects to our teachers, especially Tan Amarasiri, by bowing 3 times. And I was also asked by one of the session members to let people know that because there's a presentation that's being shared on the screen, the usual typical gallery view where you can see each other is not currently available. But if you go into your view options, you should be able to choose the option where you see the presentation along with the participants, and that way you will see everybody as small thumbnails either on the side or the bottom or the top of your screen. So in case anyone is wondering whether anyone else is there online, this is the way for you to figure out. And you're not alone, just to let you know, we're all there. Thank you. I now hand it over to you, Tana Amarasiri.
Great. Thank you, Nitya, and thanks everyone. So as usual, let's start by paying homage to the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha by chanting Itipiso. Itipiso Bhagavara Sambuddho Vijacharana Sampanno Sugato Lokavidhu Anuttaro Purisadhamma Sarati Tadeva Manusanang Buddho Bhagavati Savakato Bhagavata Dhammo Sandetiko Akaliko Ehipasiko Panayiko Pachatang Vedita Bhovinyo Kiti Supatipanno Bhagavato Savaka Sangho Pujupatipanno Bhagavato Savaka Sangho Nyaya Patipanno Bhagavato Savaka Sangho Samichi Patipanno Bhagavato Savaka Sangho Yadidan Chatari Purisa Yuga Niyata Purisa Puggalae Sabhagavato Savaka Sangho Ahuneyo Pahuneyo Dakineyo Anjali Karaniyo Anuttaran Punyaketam Lokasati Ye Dhamma Hetu Bhava Te Sanghetum Tathagato Aha Te Sancha Nirodho Evang Vadi Mahasama. Welcome everyone. So the last couple of phrases that I chanted was the Pali verses of Venerable Asaji's utterance to Venerable Sariputta. Listening to that, Venerable Sariputta attained stream entry, and then he repeated these very verses to Maha Moghallana, and Maha Moghallana attained stream entry as well. So as we spoke about Venerable Sariputta last time, and we're speaking of Venerable Moghallana this time, let that be our homage to the great Venerables, the Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Maha Moghallana. And as we spoke last time, the phrase or the gatha means all phenomena have a cause. and the Tathagata has declared their cause. And the Maha Samana, the great recluse, the Buddha, also teaches of their cessation. Very inspiring. And that's literally the core or the pillar of the Buddhist, one of the pillars of the Buddha's teachings. And interestingly, something I failed to share last week was that the first chant that we did, the Tipiso chant, was the chant that Venerable Sariputta taught his mother when just before his passing away. And we shared that story last time. So he actually teaches her the virtue of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha by using that chant. So again, very, very powerful. So, so paying homage to our teachers. I should have had this slide on when we chanted. Okay, so what are we going to talk about this week? Okay. So this week we're going to start with Venerable Maha Moghallana. Okay, there are a few changes I've made to the course outline, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So we'll talk about something called the three miracles. Then whenever you talk of Maha Moghallana, you have to talk about psychic powers. You have to talk about psychic attainments, because his life and collectedness, right? Samadhi, jhana, samadhi, abhinya. So the word abhinya actually means higher knowledge. We'll look at a little bit of the path to abhinya, how abhinya is used as tools, both of these in the words of the Buddha. We'll talk about the awakening of Maha Moghallana, some vignettes from his life, some really interesting stories, and finally, the words that Buddha used to praise Venerable Maha Moghallana. Now, if you look at the picture that's displayed on the screen, it's very similar to the picture of Venerable Sariputta that we saw last time, except that Maha Moghallana has a bluish hue, right? And when you read the Maha Moghallana Theragatha, which the authorship of which is ascribed to Venerable Maha Moghallana himself, he describes himself to be of the hue of the blue lotus. And generally, in Indian law, any being that's vast and expansive and at the same time deep, without boundaries, like the sky, is represented in a bluish hue. And this was kind of taken on in the Buddhist tradition as well, where anyone really adept in the abhinyas, in the psychic realm, would be depicted with a bluish hue. So Maha Moghallana, the monk foremost in abhinya, psychic abilities, and the Theri Upalavanna, Aya Upalavanna, who was Maha Moghallana's counterpart in the Bhikkhuni Sangha, was also depicted in a bluish hue. So just in case you were wondering about the picture. So weeks 1, 2, and 3 kind of remained the same, okay, because there was a lot on Sariputta. I kind of struggled a little bit with getting together some information on Maha Moghallana, but we'll see how that pans out. There's a lot on Venerable Ananda. In fact, Venerable Sirimedo and I were talking, and we kind of, when you look at all the suttas, the only character that appears more often than the Venerable Sariputta is Ananda, and he usually appears with the Buddha, right? And so there's plenty about Venerable Ananda, so he has his own kind of week or slot. The week after that, I thought we'd speak about Venerable Mahakassapa and Venerable Angulimala, and speak about a little bit of the history and the origins of the Sangha, how Venerable Mahakassapa, who was the embodiment of ascetic practice and asceticism, actually created the Sangha as we know today. First, Sangha Council, how the teachings were formalized, all of that. And of course, Venerable Angulimala, who's known for his power of forgiveness, power of fearlessness. You'll see that. And then instead of just focusing on Ayakema on week 5, we'll talk of the few elder nuns. So instead of just Ayakema, we'll bring in a few more elder bhikkhunis who were arahants and who lived remarkable lives of great renunciation and discernment. Finally, we'll round it off with Anathapindika and Visakha, the two lay people, foremost disciples of the Buddha who were lay people, and we'll focus on right livelihood and generosity. Okay, so I'm not promising there'll be no further changes, but at the moment, this is how it looks. So before we start, before we go into Venerable Maha Moghallana, there was a very, very interesting story in a sutta called the Kevatta Sutta. Okay? Reference is given at the end of the slide deck. And the Buddha is having a conversation with this person called Kevatta. And Kevatta, they are in Savatthi, and Kevatta says to the Buddha, "Oh, Venerable Sir, the city is really prosperous and the Bhikkhu Sangha is doing really well. If you got a monk to perform a psychic feat, right, a demonstration of psychic ability, then there'll be a lot more faith in the Buddha's Sangha." So the Buddha just remains silent, does doesn't approve. And so the second time and the third time, and he asks Kevatta, so I get a message, okay, the internet was unstable, so there may be an issue. So he asks Venerable Kevatta, so Kevatta, if I were to allow one of the monks to display their psychic powers, if there's someone who is actually quite cynical of the Bhikkhu Sangha, all he or she might say is that, oh, there's a spell called, there is this particular spell, that other people know this, and it's no big deal. So psychic powers aren't, they're not great. If I were to ask one of the bhikkhus to display the miracle of revelation, reading people's minds, reading people's thoughts, then those who are skeptic would also say, oh, there's another spell and another ascetic who can do this, so this isn't much of a big deal. But the true miracle is the miracle of instruction, where you tell a person, this is how you should live life. This is not how you should live life. These are the things you should focus on. These are not things that you should focus on. This is the wisdom that is to be cultivated. And these are, and other than this, everything else is secondary. They're not really conducive to spiritual seeking. And he says that if someone instructs people in this way, this is what will inspire true faith, true conviction, true devotion, and true understanding of the Noble Eightfold Path, and generate goodness for the Sangha as a whole. There are also other suttas, particularly one called the Acharya Buddha Sutta, which is the sutta of the wondrous, marvelous, and the wonderful. There are a few ways of, or the surprising and the wonderful was something like a few ways of translating that. But Venerable Ananda goes through all these lists of miraculous things that have happened in the Buddha's life. And the Buddha keeps saying, oh, yeah, that's wonderful, that's miraculous, that's wonderful, that's miraculous. But Ananda, do you know the most miraculous and most wonderful? And Ananda says, oh, what, Venerable Sir, what is it that is the most wonderful and the most miraculous? The Buddha says, if someone is able to see the beginning, the residing, and the cessation of thoughts, mental concomitants, sensations, feelings, emotions, that is the true miracle. So the Buddha is always constantly bringing us down to this level of awareness, always encouraging that, yes, there may be many things that are really wonderful, really, that grab our attention, but these are phenomena. What is of greater value, far higher value, is the miracle of instruction, miracle of right living, miracle of right practice, and this kind of constantly being in touch with thoughts, emotions, general awareness in general. So having said that, and leaving that to kind of percolate, let's look at the psychic powers that are listed in the suttas. Abhinya. Abhi is higher, Nya is jnana or knowledge. So these are usually referred to as the higher knowledges. And the reason I've kind of just left the Pali names is that I'm just going to talk about them. There's no need to really kind of understand them or memorize them, but the source is also given in case you'd like to investigate a little more. So the first type of abhinya is called the iddhi vidhi jnana. Iddhi means spiritual success, spiritual power, spiritual attainment. Vidha means many varieties. Jnana is so knowledge of many, many varieties of iddhi or spiritual power, spiritual faculties. And the Buddha says, or the suttas say, this iddhi vida is like, if you're one, you can manifest as many. If you're in one place, you can manifest in different places. If you're large, you can become small. If you're small, you can become large. You can dive into the earth as if it were water. You can walk on water as if it was the earth. Various things like that. Okay. And then Dibba Sota Jnana is the knowledge of the divine ear, clairaudience, where you can listen to things that are outside the scope of hearing, outside of the present human realm. Cheto Parignyana is mind reading, abilities to read other people's thoughts, to read other people's intentions. Pubbe Nivasa Nusati Jnana, knowledge or the ability to recollect past abidings, okay, so past lives. There's the story that when the Buddha attains enlightenment, he was able to recount a multitude of his past lives. So that's another opinion. Dibba Chakkunyana, just like the divine ear, it's the divine eye. So you're able to see things that one is not immediately able to see. You're able to see different realms. It's also described that you could see the results of karma and how karma comes to fruition, how karma affects different beings in different ways, so on and so forth. And finally is the most important, which is asava kaya jnana. So asavas are affluents or defilements. Kaya means to make them kind of gradually weaken and then finally disappear. So the weakening of the defilements to the point that they completely disappear. So knowledge of that. And in the suttas, it very clearly says that the first 5 are known to be what are called lokiya beings, mundane supernatural powers. And you could have 1 or 2 or 3 or all 5, but yet you need not be fully released from suffering. And all of these 5 are the fruits of collectedness of samadhi. We'll look at that in a little bit. But finally, asavakaya jnana is the fruit of insight. It's the fruit of wisdom. It's the fruit of panya. And this is called the lokuttara abhinya. It is the only abhinya that is transcendental in nature, that can take us beyond the world. Right? Now, because of Maha Moghallana's practice, he was known to be the only monk who was, well, apart from the Buddha, that is, completely adept at all 6 of the abhinyas. There have been other monks who are spoken about in the suttas who are experts in a couple or probably 2 or 3 of the abhinyas. But Maha Moghallana was known to be adept and a master at all 6. So then we might ask, okay, what is the path to the abhinyas? Very clear in many, many different places. The Buddha very clearly says that the path to the abhinyas is a total dedication and following of the Noble Eightfold Path, broken up in its 3 characteristics, which is sila, samadhi, and panya. So if one is dedicated, we'll come to Padana Sankharas in a minute, but just the first part, the first little kind of graphic, sila, samadhi. Yeah. Each one feeds the other, and each one strengthens the other. So it's like a tripod. You know, if one leg is weak or one leg is uneven or broken or flimsy, it drags down the other 2 as well. And so there's a lot of importance given to all 3 working together. So sila, if we take sila, it's usually represented by the precepts. And this is usually good action and proper action and proper words, more or less, right? And when you actually try and understand sila a little deeper, not only does it govern our conduct, but it also governs areas of conduct. So in the Vinaya, there's actually this chant that we chant at the end of every Patimokkha, every Uposatha. After the Patimokkha is recited, there are 3 chants that we recite together. And there is reference to something called Achara and Gochara. Achara is conduct, and Gochara are the spheres of conduct, or spheres. So literally, Gochara means a pasture. So how, if there's a cow is safe in its pasture, it's fed, it's nourished, and that's how Sila works. Sila tells us how to live life within the scope of the 5 precepts, but at the same time tells us which areas that we have to function in, which areas that we must avoid, right? And by doing that, and because Sila does that, because Sila tells us proper conduct, and at the same time tells us what areas we should be conducting ourselves in, what areas we should avoid, it actually avoids raga, dosa, and moha. It avoids the 3 areas that are dangerous. That is, of course, if we are totally committed to Sila and we are, Of course, we slip up and we make mistakes and all that, but still, this is the importance of Sila, in that not only does it teach conduct, it also teaches what areas we function in and what areas we avoid. And as a result of Sila, by this proper conduct and by conducting ourselves in a proper way, in proper situations, in proper proper time and proper place, what happens is that there is no remorse, there's no doubt, there's no restlessness, and there's no guilt. And then what remains is a feeling of self-respect, self-esteem, ease. Actually, this feeling that we've done something really well, right? And so that is the fruit of Sila. And that is how Sila helps Samadhi. By inculcating this feeling of ease and inculcating this feeling of relaxed easefulness, pasu viharati, as it said in the suttas, what happens is that our mind becomes collected. And not only that, if we function according to Sila and maintain and protect and cultivate Sila properly, we are avoiding raga, moha, and dosa. So that's an added collectedness, an added wholesomeness that comes into the practice. So this is how Sila strengthens Samadhi. Now, with strong Sila and strong Samadhi, the mind is stable, the mind is calm, the chitta is at ease, the chitta is relaxed, there's confidence in one's life, confidence in one's abilities, confidence in one's actions. And when there is that collectedness, when everything is stable, when everything is calm, that is when insight and wisdom can actually arise. So this is how Samadhi, Sila and Samadhi strengthen Panya. And of course, if we are wise, we know that we should do the wholesome and avoid the unwholesome. So we go back to Sila. And if we are collected, we realize, oh, this collectedness is a result of Sila. So we go back to Sila again. So all of these things, Sila helps Samadhi, Samadhi helps Panya, Panya helps Sila again. And it's a beautiful, beautiful cycle. But when we talk of Sila, Samadhi, and Panya, and collectedness in terms of the abhinyas, the Buddha says that it always has to be accompanied by something called the padana sankharas. So sankhara is used in many, many different, translated in many different ways and many different contexts. In this particular context, sankhara is a mental volition, a wholesome mental volition. And padana means something that is established. So a mental volition that leads to establishment is called a padana sankhara. And there are 4. These are also called the iddipadas. And the more we work with these iddipadas, and the more the better we get at using them to support collectedness, to shore up collectedness, to steady collectedness, then automatically there's panya and it will lead to abhinyas, right? And they are chanda, which is enthusiasm, virya, which is energy, effort, diligence. Chanda is also a kind of commitment, a kind of confidence and enthusiasm. Then you have virya, which is energy, effort, diligence. Then you have chitta, which is awareness. And finally, mimamsa, which is a reflection. So as we practice sila, it helps in collectedness. Sila and collectedness help in wisdom. And then as they're constantly shored up by these four factors, by these iddhipadas, where we are constantly cultivating enthusiasm, we are cultivating diligence, we are being aware all the time, being wakeful, being alert, and finally reflect on whatever is going on, then automatically abhinyas will arise. Now, I'm simplifying this a lot. Uh, it's obviously abhinyas take a lot of effort and a lot of, it has to be done repeatedly, right? Um, it probably doesn't happen overnight. Okay? But it's very important to understand the relationship of how sila affects samadhi, how samadhi affects panya, how we are constantly kept within the realm of the wholesome, and how we constantly avoid the unwholesome, and how we can use enthusiasm, diligence, awareness, and reflection to actually shore up collectedness within us. And these are called the iddhipadas as well. Pada, it means a foundation. Iddhi is spiritual power, spiritual success. So these padana sankharas are also called iddhipadas. So just wanted to, and obviously, because Venerable Maha Moghallana was a master at this, he was able to attain the abhinyas, all 6 abhinyas to perfection. Now, generally, what happens is when people speak of samatha, samadhi, jhanas, abhinyas, it almost becomes like a kind of a separate piece in Buddhism that's somehow not related to insight, that's somehow not related to the Four Noble Truths. It becomes dangerous because it's very easy for us to attach to it and hanker after it, thereby promoting more tanha, more craving, creating channels for bhava and vibhava tanha. That is allowing becoming, allowing annihilation, all of that. So the Buddha very clearly defines how abhinyas are to be used. Right? Again, the sutta reference is given at the end. He says, you use abhinyas to comprehend the 5 aggregates in their entirety. Parinyayam, again, the same word that's used in the Four Noble Truths. There is the noble truth of dukkha, and this truth of dukkha has to be understood. Then the next step is to abandon avidya and tanha, to abandon ignorance and desire. Again, the same formulaic thing of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, pahatabam, has to be let go of. So, has to be abandoned. So, dukkha samudayam ariya satcham pahatab. So, you have to let go of the arising or the root or the cause of dukkha. Then Sachikatabam. What does one realize? One realizes knowledge and freedom, Vidya and Vimutti. And again, using Abhinya as a tool for this realization. And finally, cultivating calm and insight, Samatha and Vipassana, Bhavetama. So this is not a stepwise thing. They all work together. All this has to be done, or probably all this would happen simultaneously. I'm not able to really kind of say anything concrete about the exact process, but you can see how all of these help, right? So if there are these psychic powers and these conduits to higher knowledge, then obviously what else would you do with it? Apart from ending of suffering, apart from approaching it in the format of the Four Noble Truths by saying there are things that need to be understood, there are things that need to be abandoned, there are things that need to be realized, and there are things that need to be cultivated. So the Buddha says that abhinya, cultivation of abhinya, if it is done with a personal sense of ambition, a personal sense of pride, with a feeling of craving or grasping in order to improve one's status, it's a very dangerous route to take, right? Won't succeed. But then abhinyas, if they are used in this kind of format, they are tools for the end of suffering, for final release and complete knowledge, ending of avidya. So now we come to Venerable Maha Moghallana, and as we spoke about last week or discussed last week, what happens is that Venerable Sariputta meets Venerable Asaji. He hears the teaching. He gets a certain level of understanding. Then he says, okay, now I've got to go tell this friend. Now this friend, who was called Upatissa, no, Upatis, what was his... Kolita, thank you. Yes, sorry. My mind froze for a moment. So Kolita, he goes to his friend Kolita, repeats the same verse. Then both of them get really inspired. They get deep knowledge. And both of them go to the Buddha and become the Buddha's disciples. The Buddha ordains them. And as we discussed last time, Venerable Sariputta stays with the Buddha. And he reaches full understanding, complete end of suffering after 2 weeks. Maha Moghallana, on the other hand, and the suttas don't say why, but he is inspired to leave the Buddha, leave the Sangha, and go to an isolated place. And he goes to this isolated place and he sits in meditation. And within a week, he attains full understanding and attains the end of suffering. And the suttas very clearly say that, this is no comparison that, Maha Moghallana did it in a week, Sariputta did it in 2 weeks, so Maha Moghallana should have been more adept than Venerable Sariputta and things like that. But actually, the suttas say that because Venerable Maha Moghallana's route and because of the path that he took to achieve final liberation was more in tune with the body, with calming the body, calming the mind, getting into the jhanas, and applying the jhanas in such a way that he cultivates abhinyas. The scope of his practice or his gochara was much more limited than Sariputta's gochara. So Sariputta's field of activity, his approach, required a far greater level of understanding and required much more breadth. And hence, he takes a little longer. The story goes that during this 1 week, when Maha Moghallana was practicing, he faces a lot of sloth and torpor. He's constantly bombarded by, I wouldn't call it laziness, but just this inability for the mind to be fresh, this inability of being alert, this constant sense of drowsiness, constant sense of sleepiness. And the Buddha is constantly surveying what's going on. And he realizes that Maha Moghallana is facing these difficulties. So he actually comes to Maha Moghallana and psychically conveys to him what Maha Moghallana should do in order to get rid of this drowsiness, in order to get rid of this sleepiness. And there are various techniques that the Buddha recommends. And the first of which is, if you know the cause of your drowsiness and sleepiness, just don't think of that. Don't associate with that. Shift your reflection, shift your your analysis to something different, right? And the simile of the carpenter using one peg to remove another peg comes to mind. Basically, the Buddha is saying, just don't dwell on on the cause of this drowsiness and sleepiness, and shift, have a paradigm shift, shift your focus to something else. Now, if that becomes difficult, then what you can do is recollect your teachings, recollect things that have inspired you in your practice, recollect your insights, various things like that. So basically, review and recollect the teachings. That's another tool that we can use to overcome drowsiness. And he says, if that doesn't work, then rub your limbs to increase blood circulation. Right? If that doesn't work, stand up. If that doesn't work, walk up and down. If that doesn't work, splash some water on your face. If that doesn't work, mindfully lie down on your right side and have a period of rest. But once you have been rested and you feel energized, then sit up again and resume your practice. Don't go to the fourth refuge. Don't seek the Dubé at that point, right? So very, very concrete kind of advice that the Buddha keeps giving Maha Moghallana. And Maha Moghallana then works with all of this. And at one point, he asks the Buddha about, okay, can you please tell me how a monk actually realizes full freedom by understanding desire and how it works? And how does a monk actually escape desire? Then the Buddha teaches him, he works with that. Then at the end of the week, he becomes fully realized. So here, very often, when we look at Maha Moghallana, we are quick to recognize his psychic abilities and psychic powers, but that's not him. That alone is not him. If you look at only that aspect of Venerable Maha Moghallana, then we are doing him a grave injustice. There's so much more to Venerable Maha Moghallana, which is displayed just by the way he approaches enlightenment. He wants to know the role of craving. He wants to know how to end craving. So there's a lot of reflection there. And the suttas make it very clear that both Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Maha Moghallana reach final understanding, reach complete knowledge, the utter freedom from suffering by using both wisdom and tranquility. So samatha and vipassana. So they're both panya vimutta, released by wisdom, and cheto vimutta, released from the heart as a result of the collectedness of the heart. So just as last time when we looked at a few utterances of Venerable Sariputta when he awakened, let's look at a couple of utterances. Again, these are selected from the Theragatha. So Venerable Maha Moghallana says, the teacher has been served by me. The Buddha's teaching has been done. The heavy burden has been dropped. The conduit to becoming has been uprooted. That goal has been attained by me, for the sake of which I have gone forth from the home life into homelessness, the destruction of all fetters. Very, very inspiring. So these are his own utterances after he awakens. Doesn't speak about avinya, doesn't speak about jhana, doesn't speak about samadhi. But in keeping with the Buddha's teachings, in keeping with his fellow arahants, he talks about how practicing the Buddha's teaching is actually serving the Buddha. So probably a really clear instance where, we come across people who say, "Oh, I'm Buddhist. I was born in a Buddhist family. I was born into Buddhism." They don't keep the 5 precepts. They don't meditate. What's the point? The Buddha himself says, the way that you show true devotion to me is by putting my teachings into action. Maha Moghallana embodies that. Maha Moghallana epitomizes that. Right? He speaks about the heavy burden that's been dropped. He speaks about becoming and how the conduit that allows becoming has now been uprooted. So there can be no further activity there. There can be no further movement there. He speaks about the renunciant life and value of renunciation, of going forth from home to the homelessness, and hence the destruction of all the fetters. Okay? Very, very interesting. So I thought I'll kind of highlight these phrases from the Maha Moghallana Theragatha. Then, of course, we come to the Venerable Sariputta and the Venerable Maha Moghallana. And the Buddha himself says that, there are many instances where he praises both of them together. And he says, one day he's giving a discourse to the Bhikkhu Sangha, and suddenly he breaks into this inspired verse. The collection of the Buddha's inspired verses is called the Udana. That's available. So one of the Udanas, he says, is that if a mother were to teach her child, she should say this. She should say, "O son," or "O daughter," perhaps. The Udana says son. If you are going to live the life of a householder, be like Chitta and Hataka. We'll look at Chitta and Hataka when we talk about Anathapindika and Visakha. But he says, he says that the mother should teach the child by saying, "Oh child, if you're going to live the life of a householder, you should be like Chitta and Hataka. But if you decide to live life as a mendicant, if you decide to leave the home and go into homelessness, then you have to emulate Sariputta and Moggallana." The Buddha himself says that. What a huge compliment. Right? Very, very inspired. So the Buddha says each mother should teach her child this. So that's the amount of regard with which he holds Maha Moghallana and Venerable Sariputta. And as we've seen, they've had a really long association, not just in their present lives as Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Maha Moghallana, but goes back to many, many more lifetimes. Numerous examples in the Jataka tales and things like that, in the Dhammapada, where all of these stories are showcased about their past lives. But their association has always been one of much closeness, very, very deep friendship. They were born into similar situations. Their families were somewhat similar or equal in status, equal in caste. They ordain at the same time. And the manner of their death is quite different. We'll look at that later. Venerable Sariputta dies on the full moon of the Kartika month. 2 weeks later, on the new moon, Venerable Maha Moghallana attains Mahaparinibbana. And we'll look at that in a little more detail. Their awakening was also slightly different in the sense that Venerable Sariputta chooses to stay with the Buddha, chooses to stay with the Bhikkhu Sangha. Venerable Maha Moghallana decides to be a little more secluded. So he goes into a little wood at the end of a village. So he relies on that village for alms round, but yet he's secluded when he needs to be. And the duration we spoke about, Venerable Maha Moghallana did it in a week. Venerable Sariputta took 2 weeks. Again, these are just numbers, and in these stories, right? But it represents, probably it represents the path that they took, and hence the time that was needed. When we read about these two great personages, the core strengths of Sariputta seem to be more wisdom oriented, analytical, teaching, whereas Venerable Maha Moghallana's core strengths seem to be wisdom that arises out of collectedness, out of jhanas, out of his psychic powers. And so, even though there aren't very many written records of Venerable Maha Moghallana giving discourses, there are a few discourses that he gave. One can just imagine the presence of a monk like this. What would it feel like to be in the presence of such a being? Right? And there are instances where Venerable Maha Moghallana teaches both by conduct as well as by understanding. So their core strengths are different, but their teaching styles kind of somewhat diverge, or the way they approach their teaching comes from different places. As we spoke last time, Buddha said that Venerable Sariputta is like the mother who gives birth to the child. Venerable Maha Moghallana is like the nurse who nurses it. And so Venerable Sariputta will take on an aspirant and will train that aspirant till the time the aspirant reaches Sotapatti, or reaches stream entry, and then would leave that disciple to work out the rest of the puzzle by himself. Maha Moghallana, on the other hand, would go with his disciple, with his aspirant, all the way till the end, till arhatship. And we can see that this is also because that's exactly the way the Buddha guided Venerable Maha Moghallana to his own enlightenment. Buddha was there at every step. He keeps telling Venerable Maha Moghallana, don't do this, do that. If you're drowsy, do this. If you want to understand the ending of desire, this is how you approach it, so on and so forth. So the Buddha is in constant touch with Venerable Maha Moghallana till Venerable Maha Moghallana reaches complete understanding and complete freedom. And that is exactly how Venerable Maha Moghallana trains his students as well. And finally, one thing that really stands apart is this kind of noble friendship. There's a lot of admiration that each one has to the other. There are instances where each one helps the other. So this forms the basis of Kalyana Mittata. And not only for themselves, but because they exemplified such high levels of friendship, the other bhikkhus living there saw this and were inspired to actually emulate them. Venerable Anuruddha says, a harmonious Sangha is a Sangha which mixes as easily as milk mixes with water. It becomes totally, there's no friction there. It becomes, and there's no separation. It's not like oil mixing with water. It's like milk mixing with water. And he's inspired by the example set by Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Maha Moghallana. There is one particular passage in the Suttas where Venerable Sariputta looks at Venerable Maha Moghallana and says, in the field of psychic ability, when I look at you and when I look at me, I feel that I'm a little splinter of rock and you're the mighty Himalayas. Venerable Maha Moghallana says, oh dear friend, when I look at myself and when I look at you in the area of wisdom and understanding, I'm like a tiny grain of salt and you're like this huge barrel filled with salt. Beautiful kind of appreciation of each other's core strengths, each other's, for what each other is really known for, and things like that. Very inspiring. So, of course, They are good friends. They practice together in many instances. They take on certain duties. So the first thing is that they are the Buddha's aides. They are towards the end of his life, when the Buddha is kind of sick, when he's tired, he delegates a lot of teaching to Venerable Sariputta, Venerable Maha Moghallana, and sometimes to Venerable Ananda. Venerable Ananda always lives close to the Buddha. Venerable Maha Moghallana always lives close to Venerable Sariputta. And the Buddha himself says that when the Sangha is with Venerable Sariputta and with Venerable Maha Moghallana, I have nothing to worry about. So that is the level of trust. That is the level of confidence the Buddha had in his two chief disciples. And then we come to a very interesting story about the group of 6 in the Vinaya Pitaka. Most monks know of the group of 6 because we kind of study the Vinaya, and the group of 6 is somewhat infamous. Okay, there's 6 monks who do everything wrong and who do everything bad, and they're absolutely naughty, they're absolutely discordant, they're absolutely sometimes you read these accounts and you shake your head. Gosh, I don't believe this. A monk actually doing something. Anyway, story goes that this group of 6 monks were constantly misbehaving. And then it comes to a point at this place called Kitagiri, where the Buddha is actually fed up with them. And he tells Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Maha Moghallana to take a group of monks with them and actually go and expel this group of 6 from the Sangha. Now, the reason why the story is mentioned in the Vinaya Pitaka is because Maha Moghallana and Sariputta, apart from just expelling them, set up this whole format of how the Sangha actually approaches disciplinary action, both the Bhikkhu Sangha and the Bhikkhuni Sangha. So there are 4 steps when it comes to this. So the first, 4 kammas that need to be done, 4 legal actions that need to be done. The first one is called Patidesaniya kamma, where an offender is actually called by the Sangha and they are admonished, right? And it's done in a very gentle manner. It's done in a manner and a hope that the person who is transgressing will mend his ways and come back to fold, behave properly. If that doesn't work, then there's something called Nisaya kamma, where 2 or 3 monks are actually put in charge of this person who's transgressing, and they watch him all the time till he changes his ways. Then the other thing is called Tajaniya kamma. So the index finger is called the Tajani in Pali. So Tajaniya kamma actually means pointing the finger. So the Sangha gets together and actually points the finger at the monk who's transgressing and says, hey, don't do this. You better shape up or else you're out. It's considered like the final one. And after the Tajaniya kamma, if the bhikkhu still doesn't mend his ways, bhikkhu or bhikkhuni, then what is called Pabbajaniya kamma is enforced, where the bhikkhu is actually expelled from the Sangha, no longer part of the Buddhist fold. And that's quite a harsh thing. Right? So Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Maha Moghallana actually designed this whole series of actions that are needed. So that's their commitment to keeping discipline within the Sangha, maintaining a certain standard of behavior. And so it shows their commitment to the Sangha as a whole. And when the Buddha's cousin, the evil Devadatta, decides, well, first he tells the Buddha that he'd like to be the leader of the Sangha. The Buddha says, hey, I'm not even giving that position to Sariputta and Moghallana. Why would I give that to you? Right? So then Devadatta collects a group of monks and actually leaves. So then the Buddha tells Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Maha Moghallana, you actually go there and get these monks back. Not because the Buddha was keen on having a large Sangha, but out of compassion for these monks so that they do not get misled by Devadatta. They don't go into the wrong way and fall into deeper suffering than what they already are facing. So he trusts Venerable Sariputta and Moggallana, and they go there and they convince the monks and they bring them back to the Buddha. So again, that's considered one of their biggest kind of coup de grace, one of their largest victories. And finally, by their conduct, they would teach the Sangha, not just by formal desanas, by formal Dhamma talks, but it says that wherever they're staying, usually they stayed in Savatthi near Nalaka Grama, where they both had where they both were born and were raised. They would apparently share the same room. They'd share the same kuti, right? And they would have all these discussions between themselves so that all the other monks can listen and learn from. So it was a kind of informal teaching, form of organic teaching, really beautiful, spontaneous, organic. So these are some of the highlights of the excellent pair in action. So, of course, we come to Venerable Moggallana's role in the Sangha. He was the other Aggasavaka, the highest disciple of the Buddha after Venerable Sariputta. Actually, Venerable Sariputta and Maha Moghallana are equal in the Buddha's eyes. Foremost in collectedness, and hence he gets the title Abhijñāpati, Lord of the Abhijñas, Lord of higher knowledge. He also acts as a preceptor. So last week, when we discussed Rahula's going forth, Sariputta becomes his preceptor. That is when he goes forth as a samanera, as a novice. Then after that, when he's old enough to be a bhikkhu, you need to be 20 years old to be a bhikkhu. Both Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Maha Moghallana act as, in Pali, even today in ordinations, apart from the preceptor, you have an Anusavanacharya and a Kammavacharya. So one teacher who acts, one teacher who teaches instruction on meditation and spiritual progress, and another teacher who instructs the aspirant in conduct and etiquette and things like that. So Anusavanacharya and Kammavacharya. So Sariputta becomes the Anusavanacharya for Rahula, and Maha Moghallana becomes the Kammavacharya for Rahula, and both of them together train this young monk and take him up to arahantship. And Venerable Maha Moghallana is always seen as this really dynamic second in command. There's another really beautiful story that highlights this. So one day, I forget where they were staying, but they were staying, the Buddha was there, Venerable Sariputta, Venerable Maha Moghallana, and then there's this group of newly ordained monks who are quite rowdy and they're quite ill-behaved. They're making a lot of noise, they're probably laughing a lot, they're talking a lot, and this disturbs the Buddha. So the Buddha actually calls them and kind of puts things straight and sends them off and says, go and practice. Stop wasting your time like this. And then he looks at Venerable Sariputta and says, so Sariputta, when I did that, what did you think I was thinking? So Venerable Sariputta tells the Buddha, oh Lord, I was thinking that the Tathagata wishes to enjoy the bliss of meditation, and hence Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Maha Moghallana, being his chief disciples, should do the same thing. The Buddha actually admonishes him and says, no, Sariputta, that's wrong. Don't think that way. Then he turns to Venerable Maha Moghallana and says, so, Maha Moghallana, what did you think that I was thinking? And Maha Moghallana says, well, Lord, I was thinking that the Tathagata wants to enjoy and relax in the bliss of meditation, and hence Venerable Sariputta and I must take charge of the Sangha to ensure that the Tathagata enjoys this bliss of meditation. Then the Buddha praises him, says, wonderful, Moghallana, you've actually understood. That's actually what I want. That when I'm on retreat, when I'm meditating, when I'm in seclusion, both of you should take charge. So this is the only instance where the Buddha kind of admonishes Venerable Sariputta and praises Venerable Maha Moghallana. But from the story, we can take away that Venerable Maha Moghallana was always looking out for the welfare of not just the Sangha and himself and Sariputta, but also for the Buddha at the same time. So if the Buddha wants to go on retreat, he's always there to take, he and Sariputta are always there to take charge. So now we come to a few stories that are very, very interesting, and I am also cognizant of the time. So the first story is when all the monks meet together with the Buddha for the full moon and the new moon. It's called the Uposatha. The Pali Uposatha means to sit close together. So the whole Sangha will come together, and then the monastic rules are chanted. So if you actually think about it, from the time of the Buddha till now, every new moon and every full moon, a group of 4 monks or more, or 4 nuns or more, have come together, and the monastic rules have been recited. So it's this living tradition, unbroken tradition, that's really, really important. So at this one time, the whole Sangha is gathered. It's either a full moon or the new moon. And Venerable Ananda requests the Buddha to chant the Patimokkha, the monastic rules for the monks. And the Buddha just stays silent. And Ananda requests again, Buddha remains silent again. Then the night is kind of passing, and just before dawn, the Buddha says, I'm not chanting the Patimokkha because there's one monk here who's actually impure. So Venerable Maha Moghallana uses his powers of mind reading, reads the mind of all the bhikkhus sitting there, identifies the monk, and goes and tells him, please leave. The monk refuses to, tells him again, leave. Monk refuses. So grabs him by the hand, picks him up, walks him out, and expels him from the Uposatha hall. He comes back, and then the Buddha starts chanting the Patimokkha. Now, as a monk, it's a big deal for me to, this story means a lot, but I'm sure it must be inspiring for lay people as well. Then, of course, there's the story of the Buddha taking a group of monks up to the Tavatimsa heaven to offer a teaching to the Devas. And as they are passing, they cross the residence of this really powerful Naga deity called Nandopananda. And that's the picture on the top right. And Nandopananda, apart from being a Naga, is really renowned for his psychic abilities and powers. So he gets angry that the Buddha and his group of monks walk past or fly past or fly above his place of residence. So he comes and starts harassing the Buddha. All of the monks who are gathered say, oh Lord, please let me go and handle Nandopananda. Buddha refuses. Finally, Venerable Maha Moghallana says, okay, I'll go and deal with Nandopananda. The Buddha says, okay, Moghallana, you go. So Venerable Maha Moghallana goes there, and they have this huge kind of battle, and Venerable Maha Moghallana wins, brings back Nandopananda to the Buddha. The Buddha offers him a teaching, offers him advice. And of course, there are numerous stories of him being the teacher of gods and humans. So again, shares this distinction with the Buddha. We'll look at I think there's a couple, anyway, there are many stories, especially if you read the Dhammapada and the Jatakas, there are many stories of how Venerable Maha Moghallana teaches the Devas. And then there was this monk called Migara. Migara was the son of Visakha, the foremost female lay disciple of the Buddha. Migara becomes a monk. And Migara's mother, that is Visakha, builds this huge mansion that she gives to the Sangha, offers to the Sangha. This mansion was fairly close to Savatthi. And it was called Migara's mother's mansion. So she makes this offering to the Sangha and tells the Buddha, I'd like to build this, but I have one condition. Buddha says, well, what's your condition? So she says, Maha Moghallana must be the foreman. He should be the supervisor of the construction. If he doesn't supervise this construction, I'm not going to offer this to the Sangha. So the Buddha kind of smiles and shakes his head because he knows, right? He knows what's going to happen. So Venerable Maha Moghallana takes over as the foreman, and Maha Moghallana just kind of, because of his psychic abilities, all these bricks keep coming and the walls are raised in no time, flooring is done. I'm sure it'll be all done to code. Right now we're building the Dhamma hall, so we've got to make sure everything's up to code. Coming from India, it baffles me. Right? Code? What code? So anyway, so the mansion is completed in no time at all. So it's occupied. The Buddha is sitting on the top floor. And then there are monks at the lower level, and they're talking and they're being probably too loud. And the Buddha tells Moghallana, they're making too much noise. Go and, shake them out of their complacency. So Venerable Maha Moghallana goes and stands at the tip of this mansion and with his big toe just nudges it. And the whole mansion shakes. Then all the bhikkhus are now, oh gosh, what's happened? They're kind of frightened out of their complacency, frightened out of their carelessness, frightened out of their heedlessness. And then they sit down, they realize, oh my God, what we're doing is wrong. Kind of reminds me when all of us young monks are noisy and loud. Lumpur V would just come and poke his head round the doorway. That's all that's needed. He doesn't have to say anything. So it happens till today. And the same thing happens when Maha Moghallana goes up to the heavenly realms and sees Sakka, and he's giving him a teaching. Sakka is being overly relaxed. So Moghallana says, okay, this guy needs to be shaken out of his complacency. And again, just puts a little bit of pressure with his big toe, and then his banner of victory shakes. And the palace of Sakka is almost as if it's in an earthquake. Then Sakka realizes, oops, what I'm doing is wrong. I should pay more attention when the Dhamma is being preached. Then he settles himself and he takes on the teaching. In the northern traditions, Venerable Maha Moghallana is the epitome of compassion and filial piety. Even in the Theravadan tradition, and both the Petavattu and the Vimanavattu deals with all of the different cosmic realms. And the Petavattu deals with all the hell realms and all the beings there. So Venerable Maha Moghallana is known to actually understand their plight. As a result of his abhinya, he was able to see how karma manifests in wholesome results and unwholesome results. And he's actually really compassionate, helps them in. So here's a picture of this hungry ghost and Venerable Maha Moghallana offering sustenance and food so that the hungry ghost is relieved of hunger and then born again at a more favorable destination. And the picture to the right are these lanterns that are floated on a river. This comes from the northern tradition, especially in China, Malaysia, Singapore. There's this huge festival called Ulumbana, and comes from the Indian word avalambana. And avalambana actually means going back to the beginning, right? And so you dedicate merits to your dearly departed, to your ancestors. And in the northern tradition, because Venerable Maha Moghallana really cared for his parents, Ulumbana is celebrated, or this, it's one of the stories or one of the legends is that Ulumbana is celebrated as a big festival in honor of Venerable Maha Moghallana. So, Michael from Malaysia, you should probably tell me if I'm right or wrong. And finally, so there are two pictures here. I'll come to the black and white picture in a minute. But then, how does Venerable Maha Moghallana die? So, on the full moon night when Venerable Sariputta passes away, Venerable Maha Moghallana is on his walking path. He's walking up and down. Suddenly, he feels very, very uneasy. So he sits down and he finds that Mara is there in his bowels. So using his psychic abilities, he says, Mara, come out. I know you're there. I know you're troubling me. Mara is really surprised because Mara thought, oh, even the Buddha can't detect me. He's really shocked that Maha Moghallana could detect him so quickly. So anyway, Mara comes out of his mouth and he stands there at the doorway, and Moghallana just kind of looks at him. And Mara says, how could you detect me so quickly? And why aren't you afraid of me? So Moghallana says, well, Mara, it's because we are related. And the first Buddha of this kappa, of this eon, of our auspicious eon, which is called the Baddha Kalpa, was the Buddha Kakusanda. And at that time, I was the Mara. And you were my nephew. You were my sister Kali's son. And, you know, Venerable Maha Moghallana, when he was Mara Dusi, so he says, my name was Mara Dusi, and my sister was Kali, and Kali was your mother. Now you are the present Mara. So you're my nephew, so I know you, right? Don't think you can fool me. So once this incident happens, Venerable Maha Moghallana gets this feeling that his end is near. And he's also aware of a few karmic things. We don't have time to get into all those stories, but he knows that there are some karmic tendencies that are yet to catch up with him. So as his death approaches, there's a group of naked ascetics who are very, very jealous of the Buddha. And they hire and they talk amongst themselves, oh, this Buddha, he's taken away our livelihood. All our followers have gone to him, and all our offerings are now diverted to the Bhikkhu Sangha. So this is really bad. And who's responsible for this? So they all say, oh, it's Maha Moghallana, because he's, the foremost in psychic powers. He inspires everyone. And so he's the guy who's responsible. So they say, okay, let's hire a band of brigands and we'll make sure that, they take care of Maha Moghallana, that they finish him off. So they hire this group of brigands and they come to Venerable Maha Moghallana's kuti. Using his psychic powers, he knows that they're coming. So he vanishes through the keyhole. So they find that he's not there, then they come back another time and he escapes through the ceiling. There are kind of varying versions of this, but more or less this is what happens. He escapes each time they come. And this is not because he fears death, but it's because he wants them to be spared of the karmic consequence of killing an arhat. So even at the very last moment, what manifests is compassion and care for the others. So his karmic tendencies catch up with him at some point, and the brigands are able to enter the hut, and he's there, and they kind of beat him to pulp, and yet he holds on to life. Then, after they leave him be, they go away, using his powers of collectedness and jhana and abhinya. He's able to teletransport himself to the Buddha, offers his respects, his last verses, then attains Mahaparinibbana. Again, some accounts say that he goes somewhere else, and some accounts say that he attains Mahaparinibbana at the Buddha's very feet. That's not important. What's important is the compassion that really manifests. And that takes us to this black and white image. So the figure in the middle is the Venerable Shu Yun. He's known as Empty Cloud. I think he was born in 1860 and died, no, 1840 and died in 1959. A great master of Chan, Chinese Zen. He lived to be 120. Ordained at the age of 20. So he lived for 100 vasa as a monk. Right? Amazing, amazing. And to his left, this monk, not the lady with the gray hair, but the other monk, is the young master Shunhua, who was a very, very close friend of Lupo Sumedo. He was the founder of the city of 10,000 Buddhas. And if it weren't for Master Shunhua, Abhayagiri Monastery wouldn't exist. And so the same thing happens to Master Shu Yun, Empty Cloud. In 1951, a band of communists, probably hired by the government, surround the temple where he's in. And for many weeks, they don't let anyone go in or out. So because of his age, he falls sick because, supplies are low, food is low. And at this time, he is 111 or 112 years old. And after these long weeks of deprivation, they burst into the temple and they beat him to pulp. Right? Really, really, he's beaten to pulp. His ribs are broken. There's a lot of blood everywhere. And still he holds on to dear life. And afterwards, his disciple asks him, how is it that you didn't die? And he says, out of compassion for those who beat me. So again, very, very inspiring. In today's day and age, most recent history, we have someone who's so evolved, so full of compassion. And finally, the Buddha's words on Venerable Maha Moghallana's awakening. He says, in whom is no dependence found, with final knowledge freed from doubt, who's plunged into the deathless depths, that one I call a Brahmin true. So these were the Buddha's words when Venerable Maha Moghallana reaches enlightenment. And, both Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Maha Moghallana were born into the Brahmin community. But this is a pun on words, in that the Buddha doesn't recognize the Brahmin in Moghallana because of his birth, but he recognizes the state of a Brahmin in Maha Moghallana because he's not dependent on anything, because he's freed from all doubt. He has plunged into the deathless realm. And then what happens is, when the Buddha hears of Venerable Maha Moghallana's death and the manner of his death, the Buddha, so both of these are available in the Dhammapada verses, and their references are given in the next slide. So he says, he who punishes the innocent or harms the harmless, he will indeed meet states of injury, of pain, disease, or derangement. He'd be troubled by kings, falsely accused. He'd be shunned by relatives, all his fortune lost, burning in raging conflagration. And at the end, the hell realms await for those unwise. So you can see the kind of tone that the Buddha takes. It's a warning, but at the same time, there's a personal quality, right? Like the second of his chief disciples is dead, and is dead in a certain manner. And the Buddha knows that this is a teaching, and he highlights that teaching and utters this really, really kind of this verse in a personal tone. And then when Maha Moghallana attains parinibbana, the Buddha looks at the Sangha in front of him and tells Venerable Ananda, "O Ananda, even this, the most excellent collection of men, this highly venerated Sangha, feels empty without Sariputta and Maha Moghallana." So with that, we close. Here are the sutta references. There's a link at the bottom where last week's slide deck and last week's video are there. This week's slide deck is there. When I get this week's video, I'll add it to there as well. So whenever you want to access this, please access it. Thank you so much for all your emails, both complimentary and ideas. So I'm working on your ideas. So please feel free to get in touch with either me or Nitya if you need any other changes, you have any other questions, have any requests. So I know we've got just 4 minutes left, but I'll open the floor for questions very quickly.
Thank you, Ven Amarasiri. If anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand, either the physical hand or the Zoom hand, and I'll help you unmute. Oh, Ven Amarasiri, it looks like
great. Going once, going twice. So, okay. So then thank you very much. See you all next week.
Thank you, Ven Amarasiri, for teaching us. I request the community to pay their respects by bowing 3 times to you before we sign off.
Okay, thank you very much. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
Sadhu. That was wonderful.
Hold on a second. I haven't stopped the recording.